Today is actually quite special also for me because today, I usually moderate the master classes. Like I invite the speakers and I introduce them, and then I ask them questions and I kind of moderate the thing. But today I am actually stepping out of my role as a Chief Learning Officer and just becoming a community member. I am also a community member like all of you. And I will be sharing something that is quite a powerful framework for me personally, actually two frameworks that help me to make sense of the world around us. Maybe some of you know this. Maybe some of you know it more than me, so that's completely fine. But maybe for some of you it will be new, or some of you will be a refresher. So I'm looking forward to go through it. It's actually not like the easiest topic to present. It has some complexity in it, but I'll do my best, and then we can definitely discuss it. I also want to say that it is meant to be the title is brief introduction, so I cannot introduce everything out of those frameworks. There is literally like tens of books to read and papers and videos to watch. There's a lot of materials around these topics, so I'll try to do my best to introduce the core of it in its kind of entirety. But obviously, all of these topics go much more deeper. So, but hopefully, it's going to be a good enough introduction to the topic. So, without further ado, let me share my screen and get going. Can I maybe just a raise of hand? How many of you have heard of integral theory or spiral dynamics? You can just Dale did, Thomas. Okay, perfect. Alderico a little bit. Okay, cool, awesome. All right, perfect. Let me just minimize this here. Great. So, in our community, we speak about building a better future, right? So the MTP of OpenExO is transform the world for a better future. And for me, when we look at kind of the notion of we want the future to be better than than the present, or we're going to kind of point the future in a powerful or a positive direction, in many ways, I would call this leadership, right? We are working or aspiring or intending to take leadership over how the future will be. So not just let the future unfold, but actually step into a role of leadership. And it can be in small scale, it can be in big scale, but for me, the essence of leadership is kind of saying, I want to influence and I want to make sure or contribute for the future to be better, right? So that for me is an essence of leadership. And actually, maybe some of you know this, but I have gone to Singularity University in 2012 and have been with ExO since 2016. So I've been definitely looking into innovation and technology and kind of organizational change and sprints and all that kind of stuff. But actually, my career started actually 10 years before that in leadership. So I started as a leadership trainer and have been designing and delivering all throughout the last 20 years, actually, leadership programs for corporations, for scale-ups, for different people. I have coached several hundreds of business leaders in terms of their career, what they're trying to do, improving their impact, better managing their responsibilities, sometimes helping them to choose the next step in their career. So actually my primary background, even before technology and ExO and innovation, has been in human development and human psychology, and specifically looking at the topic of leadership. I have tried to read all of the leadership books that I could get my hands on, and it's a topic that I am personally very passionate about. So there are different definitions of leadership, and we could actually spend the whole masterclass just trying to define leadership. But for me, one kind of a definition that I work with, which might not be the best one, but it's one I believe that works for me, is that leaders improve the status quo, so they make things better, right? They don't just leave the world as it is, but they work to make the world better in some sense, like whatever that means for them. But also they are role models for their character, right? So it's not just important what they do and how things end up, but also what is important is that kind of they role model a certain way of being and certain character that other people can aspire to, right? And within any definition of leadership, you actually probably raise as many questions as you kind of answer answers. But so there is much to discuss here, but hopefully we'll unpack that throughout the masterclass here today, by some of the frameworks I'll be looking at. So that's kind of to kick things off. Now, in 2024, this is a picture of the Earth, a little bit like Jason's on his background. And what is kind of one thing that boggles my mind is that if you're sufficiently curious and open to soak in what's happening in the world in 2024, the diversity of the nearly 8 billion people on the planet, and kind of what is happening is kind of completely mind-boggling. I mean, I just selected like four things. This is a picture of an undiscovered tribe in the Amazon. Maybe Orlando knows these pictures. These are actually tribes that still live the same way, like hunter-gatherers, like they used to live before the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, and they live deep in the Amazon forest. One of the reasons why they're undiscovered is they kill everybody that tries to get in touch with them. So, um, well, they are afraid of us, right? But this is actually a picture from a drone or from a helicopter, looking kind of from the top. But it is mind-boggling that in the age of internet and global connectivity and everything, there are still people, human beings. I mean, they have arms and legs like you and I, but their world is a world of 10, 20,000 years ago. And it's absolutely incredible. I actually used to work on a leadership program a long time ago where we went to different spots in Brazil, kind of in a rural Brazil. And one of the teams actually went to like it was a contacted tribe, obviously, but they went to one of the Amazon tribes, and the kind of stories, when they came back, and how these people live, how they recognize like every plant, and every kind of when they are tracking animals, how literate they are in terms of understanding the natural world. And actually, it was an interesting tribe because the chief of the tribe was a woman, and she actually studied in the West. She went to a university, I think, in the US, and then she came back to take care of the tribe, and so she understood very well Western civilization, but at the same time, her choice was to live with her tribe in a completely different, like the way they live is completely different. Like it almost has nothing in common with the way we live, but they share the same planet, right? They are on the same planet. So very interesting. If you, by the way, just as a side bonus note, if you want to dive into it, there is a really good book called Ishmael, that I can look it up later. But it's a conversation between a man and a gorilla, and the gorilla is lecturing the man about how Homo sapiens basically spread around the world. And yeah, it's a very interesting book. So from Daniel Quinn, I think is the author. So that's one, but also at the same time, you have obviously big cities. Here, this is La Sagrada Familia, right, in Barcelona. And I chose it as a cathedral because it's interesting to know that more than half of human population, more than half of the 8 billion people are actually in one way or another religious, right? So believing in a religion, either Christianity or Islam or Judaism or Buddhism, and kind of many others. There are also a lot of flavors of Christianity, but that is also interesting, right? So in many ways, more people than not living on this planet believe that there are kind of supernatural and transpersonal forces that are important for our world, and they bring this to their life. So that is something very powerful to think about. This is a picture from Wall Street. So we have also millions and billions of people who trade financial assets and trade a derivative of derivative of derivative, and there is a whole complex financial system that um, it's kind of hard to understand actually. Banking and financial system is not that easy. It's not very intuitive. It used to be like before 1973, I think it was, when we switched from gold standard. When we kind of disconnected gold from money, it used to be fairly, straightforward to understand finances and how it all works. But now it's just like very complex, and sometimes very difficult to understand. So that is happening. And, I chose here something that is almost like a religion for non-religious people, which is sports, right? And whether that's here, it's Manchester City that just won Premier League, but many other sports. I have recently been, maybe Valanki would confirm this, but I have recently been reading a book, and they spoke about the Indian Premier League for cricket and how huge that is in India and also in many countries around. So it's kind of interesting when you look at these different. And I could continue. I mean, obviously we have conflicts going on, we have wars, we have culture, we have art, we have travel, we are launching into space. Like the complexity of our world is truly mind-boggling, and it's almost like if you wanted to like try to understand every one of these 8 billion people individually, I mean, it's just impossible, right? Like it's very hard to, with one mind, to grasp the entire diversity of the world. Yet we all share just this one planet, one blue planet in the middle of the world. So it kind of raises a question for me. If we say we want to build a better future, we want to step into leadership and build a better future, how can we actually do this if we don't fully understand the present? I mean, some of the stories I have just described, I mean, there is so little that connects these different people besides the body that they have. The way they think, what they value, what they aspire to, what they do every day is so different that it's kind of quite hard to understand. And I would kind of say that, at least for me, maybe it's just my experience, but I'm finding it harder and harder to understand the world in its complexity. Just reading news and watching things, just so many different opinions. It's very hard to know what truth actually is, who does define what truth is, and according to whom, and all that kind of stuff. So it is actually fairly complex. So I have been looking for a map that can help me to understand this entire complexity, right? Because I was kind of like, well, there needs to be some way to make sense out of this incredible human complexity of the world around us. And I was kind of looking for this map, and anyways, you probably guessed this, but I'll be presenting what I found and what is the map that I work with that helps me to navigate the human complexity that I have just presented. And in many ways, it's kind of like a meta framework, right? So, um, you know, when you are digesting information from the world around you, it is important to almost have some kind of an inner structure that you can hang all these pieces on, like that Christmas tree. Like you first need to have the Christmas tree, and then you can hang all of these different things. But if you don't have kind of a meta map, a meta structure, it then just becomes very confusing. And I think most of us developed our own meta structures. And what I find interesting about what we're presenting today is that it's kind of a the most comprehensive metastructure I have found that it can actually make sense of the complexity that I have just presented. And in many ways, this works like I'll be giving you different ideas and different words. And there's a concept in language called distinctions. So, in our language, actually, language is a very powerful tool. And the more, for example, some of you that speak multiple languages might know that you are kind of a different and a richer person if you speak more languages, right? That you can actually understand the world a little bit better because every language is a little bit different and gives you a view of the world that is a little bit different. And it works in the same way with words in language. So imagine, I put here a picture of a wine, vineyard, right? Imagine that the only wine that you know, which is not so far away from where I am, is white wine and red wine, right? Like those are the only two wines that you actually know. So then any wine that you encounter, like no matter if it's a $1,000 wine or a $5 wine in a plastic box, I mean, it's just gonna be red or white, right? Like you don't have any more distinctions. Whereas if you go to like a wine connoisseur course and you learn about different kinds of wines, you actually will start like the whole world of wine will actually unwrap in front of you. You will suddenly understand why there are different prices. You will understand different regions, different types of wines, and all that kind of stuff, right? So what I want to do today is, in relation to this map, I want to give you some words and some distinctions to help you better understand the complexity around you in a way that can enrich maybe how you see the world around and enrich your own leadership. So I'll be speaking about two different frameworks, and one of them is called spiral dynamics. The other one is called integral theory. Here are the authors of these two frameworks. Claire Graves was an American psychologist who kind of was most active in the 60s and 70s, and I'll be unpacking that much more. And Ken Wilber is still a living American philosopher. He's quite a rare person, for any of you that know him. Not only, I mean, he's incredibly smart, but his life, he has actually very difficult disease throughout all of his life. And he has also an incredible discipline. So I think for the last like 50 years, he writes like 4 or 5 hours a day. He written, I think, around 20 books. And they're not the easiest books to read. So, it's quite an important thinker. As any human beings, he has some strengths and weaknesses, but I have been very impressed by how he actually wrote one of his first books when he was in his 20s. It's called I think levels of consciousness, and he's just then continued writing afterwards. And he is kind of an integrative thinker, so he tries to research everything that humanity has ever done and put it into frameworks that can help to understand this. So I'll be actually presenting the foundations of both of these frameworks today, but just wanted to give you a little bit about those two authors, and obviously you can find tons about them online. So when I'll be describing today these two frameworks, and I chose both of them because in some sense you will see they are actually complementary, but they are like they were not created together necessarily, but they complement very well. They both operate at the level of what I call an operating system. Like if any of you have a mobile phone, you know that you have apps that help you to do things, and then you have operating system that many times when you refresh operating system, like from Windows 10 to Windows 11, like everything changes. Like all the way the system works, all the way the apps work, everything changes, right? So it's kind of like the iceberg here. And for a human being, I think we have the same, right? So we take certain decisions, actions, and behaviors. Those are like our apps. And then we get certain outcomes in the world, right? So that's like the top of the iceberg. And then below the water, though, and here maybe it's kind of like 60-40, but I think in reality there is much more below the water in a human psychology than is above the water. But we have things like thoughts, emotions, beliefs, principles, values, and underlying all of that is something called the operating system. And the operating system then determines what our values are, what our principles are, what our beliefs, emotions, and thoughts. And therefore, if we work at the level of the operating system, it's basically the deepest level of our psychology that we can work on. And I think both of these frameworks that I'll be presenting, they operate at this level of the operating system. So hopefully, I might give you an upgrade today or an enhancement of your existing operating system. So let's have a look at the overarching theory, and I have kind of plugged the spiral dynamics in the middle of it, as you will see. But integral theory has five fundamental components. Now, there are actually more, kind of advanced components afterwards, but five key components that I think form the foundation of the theory. And it's something called quadrants, stages, states, lines, and types. So this is kind of what integral theory is, and this is the structure for the masterclass today. And I'll go through each one of these one by one, and then kind of tie it all together at the very end. So let's go to quadrants first. Quadrants are telling us that when we, as a human being, when you look at the world around you, there are always four perspectives that arise and exist at the same time. And sometimes we pay attention to one or the other of these four perspectives, but they all always exist at the same time. And the four perspectives are individuals. So you as an individual have certain things happening inside of you, like individual internal. So your values, beliefs, thoughts, emotions, your identity, how you think about yourself. It's very interesting because when we kind of transition through time, you know, um, there is actually many things about you. Like all of our cells in our body, they actually change at different rates. And some of the cells actually change every few hours. I think water is like every 2 or 3 weeks, 70% of your body exchanges with the water that you drink. And there are some cells that kind of stay for, several decades. But ultimately, everything around us, like the physical, our body actually changes, but yet we still have a sense of identity kind of all throughout. Like when you think of yourself when you were 10 and 20 and 30, you have a sense of continuity, but the continuity is not physical because your body actually has changed. The old cells have died and been reborn, and you are different, but you have a sense of identity that somehow exists inside you that actually has you feel like a continuous person, right? So very, very interesting. So that's the first dimension here, things that are individual, internal. And actually, if you look at these iceberg, all of the things below the water are here, right? So in some sense, you could actually flip the iceberg on the right, on the side, and you would get these upper two quadrants. So that's individual internal. You also have individual externals. So things like your body, your physiology, the actions that everybody can observe, your behaviors, the way you move, your biology, right? Your actually your neocortex, the way your brain, like all of the things that you can objectively measure about yourself as a human being, those are in the second quadrant here. So individual and external. Then you have things that are collective, but invisible or internal, right? So things like culture, like what is really culture? You can't like slice culture, right? It's something that exists between people, relationships, archetypes. Some of you might know the world of Carl Jung, implicit norms. You walk into a room, and if people know each other and you're new there, you will very soon start to pick up there are some norms. Nobody wrote them, nobody spoke them, nobody tells you what they are, but they exist. Shared context between groups of people, even huge narratives that actually can galvanize billions of people around the world. And then, things like crowd psychology, right? If you watch a crowd at a sporting event, or there is actually, I think Salim on one of the previous masterminds was mentioning an example where there are devices that can actually measure spikes in global kind of consciousness or global awareness when there are some big events happening, either positive or negative. There's actually a device that generates random numbers. And in those moments where something like, for example, Olympics or something very bad like a war is happening and everybody is present to it, that random number generator actually gets skewed in a particular direction. So it's as if kind of the invisible collective consciousness would be somehow influencing the world of matter, right? Which is, something that even science today is trying to understand how the hell does that work. And then you have things that are collective and external. And here you have like all the systems that we are part of. So like economic system, financial system, educational system, like all the systems. Then you have processes, for example, in a company, how you get things done. You have rules and laws. You have organizations. There are creations that exist, in law, right? We have created a legal person organization. So those will be here, and things like technology, obviously, that we are all very familiar with and passionate about. So those are the four aspects of reality. And what is important about this integral framework that it kind of says all of them exist and all of them have a right to exist. It doesn't make sense to try to argue which one of these exists and which one of these doesn't. And you probably all know the conversations between the poets and the scientists about nature of love, right? So scientists are saying, well, love doesn't exist. It's just like chemicals in your brain, and it's the way your synapses, and it's like you're high on drugs when you're in love. And then the poets, so they are looking at it from the external individual, right? They are looking at, I can't measure love, like, or I can measure love, and it's just this. So they basically reduce the whole phenomena of love just to what they can measure on the MRI scan, for example. And then the poets are saying, no, but you don't understand. Like, you can maybe describe love in words, but it's like 1 out of 100. Like, love is something that just fills you, and it's like it's indescribable, right? The same for religious experiences, for mystical experiences. Like those things you can't really describe and measure, right? And both of them are right according to the integral framework. So, you know, um, modern science has kind of a tendency to try to reduce everything to the individual external, to the upper quadrant, upper right quadrant. And when it cannot be measured, it doesn't exist. But then over time, with quantum physics and with more and more measurements, it kind of realizes that actually it can measure more and more things, etc. So the same is, for example, under the bottom. So a lot of people are kind of looking at the systems and processes. They're thinking, which way to run, a country is the best? Is it democracy or benign dictatorship, or like what is the best system, right? And they are forgetting that there are all these culture archetypes and norms and people that also need to be taken into account, right? So essentially, what this invites us to do is to not reduce the complexity of the world into any of these four quadrants, but actually take them as all four that exist all at the same time. Let me give you a few examples to make it a little bit practical. So um, let's take maybe integral medicine. So obviously, traditional Western medicine is very good at fixing trauma. Like when you break a leg, you go and they kind of fix you, and is working a lot at the upper right quadrant, right? So kind of the external and the individual. But it is also known now, very well known, that if you just treat the body of the person, but you don't treat the mind of the person, sometimes they cannot recover as quickly. Like actually, a lot of stories of people who can recover much more quickly when they have a hopeful outlook about the future, for example. So that's the individual internal. And it is also true that if people belong to a family that is, for example, dysfunctional, or there are difficulties in the social system, or like the social relationships that they belong to, they have very unsupportive people around them. Again, their recovery from their illness will be much more harder. And if they don't have a health insurance, which is the systemic here, or if they cannot tap into a good network of hospitals and doctors, it is also very difficult for them to be treated. So in other words, integral medicine is a medicine that would look at all of these four quadrants and say, how can we build and address all four quadrants to help people recover? And is much more comprehensive than just the traditional medicine looking at the individual and external, right? The same for education, right? You can't just be looking about like scores and test scores, what people can take, what knowledge they have. You also need to look at, do they have confidence in themselves, right? Do they believe in themselves? Are they curious, right? Those are all things on the upper left quadrant. You also need to look at, how is the class? Like, is the class lifting them up, or is the class putting them down? And then what about their families? Family supportive to them for their education, etc. And then what is the educational system? How does, scoring work? What opportunities do they have? Can they get funding? Can they have good quality teachers? All of these things are important for education as well. And when you look at a company, many of us work with companies to help them transform, is the same there. So, it's, you can come into a company and you can work with 20 people and you can work on their behaviors, how they behave differently. You can even work on their mindsets and beliefs. But if you don't work on the culture of the organization, and if you don't work on the processes and systems that support that, any transformation that you're trying to do won't be as effective. A classical example is when you train people on the importance of teamwork, like how it's important to share and to work together in a team, and 1 + 1 = 11, and everybody can do more together. And then the next project that you have, people brainstorm and you collectively brainstorm, and then one of them takes it and says, "Oh, I invented all of that." Maybe the boss just comes and says, "This is all my idea." Yes, it was created together, but the boss doesn't say that. They get the bonus, nobody else gets anything, right? After that, nobody will ever co-create or be in a team or collaborate, right? Because the system didn't support it, right? The system valued an individual, it didn't value the collective that you were trying to shift. So even you can make a kind of a change here on the upper quadrants, the below quadrants will kind of push that back. So that's the first element, and just to kind of give you a sense, the first two elements a little bit more extensive, and then the last three will be a little bit quicker. So don't don't worry on time. So this is, I think, quite key element. And actually, you could speak a lot about just the quadrants, and you could be applying them in different settings. It's quite a powerful framework when you think of it. But it gets a little bit more interesting when we get to the next step, which is called stages. And here, let's actually begin with how stages manifest in the upper two quadrants here. So the individuals. So just for now, think of yourself and your own life as an individual. And I have here like a sample story of a woman, of a human being, and kind of describe a little bit about the stages of growth and development that she went throughout her life. So at the beginning, she was a small baby, and she was mostly kind of concerned about getting food and sleeping, and connecting and learning about the world and learning to walk and these kind of things. So in some sense, you could say that the primary concern was her survival. Then she existed, for her young age. She was a part of a nice family here. Looks like fairly harmonious. Um, Looks like her parents have glasses. She doesn't have yet. Hopefully, that's not genetically inherited. But she kind of grows up there, and here, like the family is kind of a primary. It's like a mini tribe for that little young girl, right? It becomes, the parents. She picks up a lot of patterns from her parents about life, about how to behave, what to do, what not to do. And the family is kind of, at a very early age, it's kind of the unit that, the young child or young human being belongs to, and learns a lot of things for good and for bad. Many, if many of you have experiences with therapy or psychology, you know that we pick up good things from our families, but we also pick up some bad habits and patterns that actually can sometimes be with us for the rest of our lives until we do something with them. So but I think what is key to realize around this phase is that our primary is kind of belonging to our family, right? Like we are learning what it takes to belong, and our parents are kind of everything for us, right, in that stage. Then the little girl grows up into a teenager, and you can see her purple hair. And here, actually, it's kind of a dissociation from the family. So, for any of you who have kids, you know what I mean. So, it's not so much anymore like what does mom do and what does dad do. It's much more like with my friends, and sometimes there is an authority of the teacher at school. But it's kind of a little bit like a rebellion, right? It's kind of pushing away from this unit of a family and kind of crafting your own existence in the world. And then this woman grew up into a young university student, and she has started pursuing her career, and she's learning medicine, which she's very passionate about, and kind of going forward. And she's writing the value of discipline, of structure, of being able to when you are a teenager, you kind of want everything right now, like it's all immediate. But when you're kind of, studying in a university, for example, you're learning that you need to work for 5 years, like, almost sacrifice something of yourself, of the kind of things you would like to do. You sacrifice them for something bigger, right? Something bigger in the future that you want to learn. And then she graduates from university, and she becomes a successful professional in a pharmaceutical industry. She grows very quickly through the company. She connects very well with people. She's great at leadership, manages her team. She's very well acclaimed. She travels around the world. So she becomes a very, very successful professional. But one day she actually, just kind of, she almost achieves everything that she ever wanted to achieve, but it somehow feels empty and meaningless. So she actually like kind of quits, and closes door for her old life. And she goes to an ashram in India, and she learns yoga, and then starts to actually be a yoga teacher. And she goes back home and founds a yoga studio and starts connect with people. And she looks a lot inwards, right? It's not so much about what she achieves in the world, but much more about what she can achieve internally, what she can achieve within herself. And it's a lot about connecting with people and giving her gifts to people around her. So this is a story of a one human being, right? Throughout kind of different stages of life. And you can see that as this being kind of grows through it, it's actually quite dramatic changes. I mean, the primary concern that they have, or that this lady has or woman has in these different phases, is completely different, right? At the beginning, it's safety, then belonging to the family, then like my own self-expression, my independence, then discipline and ability to achieve something, then success, right? Achieving external success, acclaim, money, power, success in work, and then finally looking much more at inner fulfillment, like what I can actually do with my life, how I can discover my purpose, my gifts, how I can give it to the world and give this to others, which is much more satisfying than, earning millions of dollars and kind of being there. And so she's gone through this journey, and each one of these jumps are actually quite big. And in many ways, you could say that when you make a jump from one of these stages to another, you kind of disconnect from who you were before. In many ways, sometimes you kind of disconnect and then you reconnect with some of the good things, but sometimes you actually disconnect completely. I mean, there are people who quit their corporate careers and just kind of stayed here and thought very badly about their previous life. I remember when I went to Brazil, I went to Goa, which is in the north, and there is actually a lot of sorry, Goa. I What's the name of it? Bahia. Bahia is the name. Sorry, Orlando. So I went to Bahia, and there were many ex-lawyers and management consultants from Sao Paulo that actually quit their jobs, and they moved to Bahia, and they got a small farm, and they founded a cooperative, and they were doing things there, and they would never ever go back to Sao Paulo and have a career, right? It's just not something that they wanted to do, and there were many people like that in Bahia that I have met. So, it is quite interesting. What is also, I think, interesting is that, this story might not like unfold like this for everybody, right? So some people actually, can maybe maybe stay in the independent expression, right? They actually never learn the value of discipline and of working hard for something, and they then have a different life as a result. Many people, kind of stay in this expert mode, and they never kind of get into the entrepreneurial, growth mindset. Might know fixed and growth mindset, right? So fixed mindset would be here, and a growth mindset would be here. Many people do spend all of their life in actually working towards external gains, and it makes them happy. Like they don't have a need, for this inner fulfillment. So it's not that this development of stages actually happens for every human being. Our lives are very diverse and they unfold differently. Yet, I would argue that, at least from my observation and from also, what we are discussing here, that these stages actually unfold quite predictably, and they give a structure for how a life can unfold of a human being. Actually, when I go to the beginning of this, so this was a story of a person, but let me now give you the theory behind it. So this is Dr. Claire Graves, and he was a psychology professor at a university in 60s and 70s in the US, and he kind of did a review of all of the theories of psychological maturity that were existing at the time. You probably know that psychology for a long time was just looking at pathology, right? Like what happens when human beings are broken. Then came Abraham Maslow, and he was the first one that said, well, that's nice, but maybe like 5 or 10% of people are pathological, but what about the 90% that are healthy? Like, what happens with their psychology, right? And he actually asked, like, what does happen with a healthy human being? And he come up with this, kind of a Maslow hierarchy of needs and the fulfillment, and at later point of his life, also self-transcendence. But he kind of look at these different things. And then there were also people called developmental psychologists, but for children, right? So, for example, Jean Piaget, some of you might know, he was studying about what are the kind of leaps that a young child goes through when they are growing and kind of gaining their cognitive capability, for example. So there is one experiment, for example, when you sit a child in front of a balloon that has like a red color on one side and a blue color on the other side, and you set another human being on the other side, and until I think at age about 5 or 6, when they see red, they also think that you see red. They cannot understand that you might see something different than they see. But at some point, around 6, 7 years of age, they develop empathy, and they are actually able to understand, because you show them the balloon, they are able to understand that, oh, I am looking at red balloon, but you are looking at blue balloon. So your experience of life is different than mine. So this is actually something that happens in children, and there are some predictable jumps that a healthy child goes through. But then, the idea was that when we become 18, when we are adults, then we are just adults. Like, that it kind of any development stops. We just don't continue. And Clark Graves was looking at all of these different frameworks, and he was like, this is really strange. Like, all of the frameworks are either saying that at the age of 18 we are done, or they are saying that we are like all somehow broken, and we are aspiring to this healthy state, but we never actually get there. And he was like, this is really weird. So he actually took classes. He did an experiment for about 10 years, and for all of his students he asked the same question, basically, what does a psychologically mature human being look like? And the way he did it is that when they started the class for 2 weeks, they couldn't like read any books or talk to anybody. They basically on their own, based on what they know, they need to create like a model of a mature, psychologically mature human being. And they wrote a paper on it. They submitted a paper, and then for another 2 weeks, they had to go and speak in a small group, present their idea about a mature human being, and then receive feedback and criticism from others. And then they all did that to each other. So then they wrote a second paper where they revised, their understanding of a mature human being. And then he got them to go for a month and actually study literature and try to find in literature the answer for what is a healthy human being, and then write a third paper afterwards about the same question, right? So quite a thorough research. And what he then did, first by himself, but then also with a lot of his students. So it's not like only he influenced, but he was trying to look for patterns between what did people say is actually a psychologically mature human being. Is it like one kind, or is it 1,000 kinds? Like, is it, what is it? And he actually was able to discover that there were actually 8 different buckets into all of the answers. Everything that was written over the decade of this experiment, everything could be classified into one of these 8 buckets. And he wrote an article actually for the Futurist magazine called Human Nature Prepares for a Momentous Leap. And you can Google it, you can find it. It's for the World Future Society, so a place where maybe some of you are members, because it's quite tied with our community. It's basically a global community of futurists, and he wrote a very powerful article about it. And he essentially outlined these 8 different worldviews, or 8 different ways to make sense of the world, 8 different stages of psychological maturity. And he actually called it like a cyclical model of psychological development. So it's not like we all are at a point A and we all aspire to a point B, which is the end. It's actually, we go through these stages in life where we go from unhealthy to healthy, and then we transition to the next stage, and the next stage, and next stage. And this is something actually that eventually, through the work of Don Beck and then Chris Cohen and his wife, Natasha Todorovic, gave rise to a concept called spiral dynamics, because it's structured as a spiral, right? And the idea is that you actually kind of grow, and you grow in complexity and in nuance from what you can understand of the world as the spiral. But it also oscillates between, you can see that all of the ones on the right are individual, right? So it's always like the survival is I-centered, this expression, we had a teenager, right? That's the also I-centered. Success is I-centered, and goes kind of here. And then these are collective, right? So you have tribes, you have kind of larger entities like religions, for example, or you have global communities, and those are all collective. So this psychological maturity of a human being oscillates between individual and collective. It grows in size and complexity. And actually, maybe a better depiction of this is something like this, where you don't actually, when you grow from one to another, you don't lose everything that, you can still do it. Sometimes you have a judgment about it, but it's still part of you, right? So you can see here from beige to purple to red to blue to orange to green. So you kind of still have access to all of these different things. So those are the stages of development. Spiral dynamics, again, much to say more about it, but maybe I would just kind of close with a couple of remarks here. So the first one is that we can go upwards, but we can also go downwards. So if you remember the movie Castaway from Tom Hanks, he started at the orange, right? He was a business executive for FedEx, very successful. Time is money. Come on, come on. And then his plane crashed on a remote island, and suddenly his mobile was useless. His BlackBerry, he had no signal. All of the like clothes and everything that he had, all of his notebooks, this computer, everything was useless. And he actually has, had to adapt much more basic ways of being to survive on the deserted island. So he descended from orange to, kind of red and purple and even survival, right? You might remember he had a Wilson, the ball, that was his purple element. It was like a little tribe, him and Wilson, because he, couldn't be just alone by himself. It's terrible for human beings to be alone. So he needed something. He had this little ball, volleyball that he was working with. So we can go up the spiral, but we can also go down. And this is tied with original, actually, insight from Clark Graves was that the more nuanced ways of making sense of the world only develop when the life conditions around us change. So it's not like they develop in absence of the world around you. They're actually a response to an environment. So if your environment gets radically more complex, you need a more complex way of making sense of the world. If your environment goes radically simpler, like for Tom Hanks in the movie Castaway, you actually need to go down and use a kind of a less nuanced framework, more crude, right? And in some sense, then this is like the ultimate software for adaptability, right? Because no matter what is happening around you, if you are able to embrace these way of making sense of the world around you, you're always in the best position to adapt to the environment around you, and to kind of look at that. So that's kind of a second element, and maybe a third one just to close this is that this obviously doesn't only exist in the upper two quadrants, right? But it also exists in the collective and the cultural. And there is way too many small letters on these slides, so I won't go into it in detail. But basically, as individuals, we have these levels of development, but also as a society, we have these levels of development, right? So we started as kind of survival bands, right? We formed tribes. We lived in a magical world, and every river and everything had a spirit. Like for those of you who know Shintoism in Japan, everything has some kind of an infusion of spirit. Then we had warlords that were kind of going and conquering others, and there was a lot of wars and fights, and then with agriculture, things became more stable. There were more resources. Actually, we could grow cities and we could grow civilization. And religions, like monotheistic religions, actually are tied closely with the rise of agriculture about 10,000 years ago when we switched from hunter-gathering to agriculture. And then over time, Industrial Revolution, 17th, 18th, 19th century, we have, at some point we were like, kind of stop relying on God to save us because, for example, I don't know, Eduardo might know this from Portugal, but I don't remember precisely the year, but there was like a huge natural catastrophes in Portugal that kind of killed like half of the people in Portugal. And it was not only that like all of the suffering of that, but actually the Pope at the time like said like it's all your fault because you were misbehaving, so God punished you, right? So you basically had this double thing, like you were suffering based on what was happening, and you were also feeling like you're guilty because because God is punishing you. So at some point, like human beings said, well, I can't rely on God to protect me anymore, so I have to do it myself, right? So that's when enlightenment came, and kind of an explosion of science and making sense of the world and harnessing technology. And a lot of actually today, when you look at modern technology, a lot of it is about we can do this ourselves. We don't need any supernatural or kind of any divine power. We can go and we can do it ourselves. Now, whether it's obviously true, I think it's up for debate, but that's the worldview. That's how it works, and it enabled us to develop incredible amounts of wealth and technological progress, right? That has some good sides and some bad sides, but that's definitely there. And then, when you get to this kind of, those fulfillments, personal, actually emotions come a lot to life, authenticity, other human beings, you're not only caring for you, but you're caring for kind of the human family and what happens with other human beings. And a lot of things like, for example, environmental movement and movement for equal rights, and a lot of these things are actually coming partially from the orange, but also partially from the green. And then you're kind of looking at these two. And that's the last thing that I want to say about this is that when you look at the yellow and turquoise memes here, you can see here these six are called first tier, so-called subsistence levels. And then second tier are something different. This is actually what Clark Graves described when he said the moment to sleep. Human nature prepares for a moment to sleep. He actually predicted that more and more of human population will be actually moving from green to yellow. And when you do that, he was saying it's kind of not like a transition. It's not the same transition like from blue to orange, from orange to green, but it's a fundamentally different transition because you, for the first time, actually don't think that your own worldview is the right one. You actually start seeing the other worldviews that you have been through before, and you realize that all of them are valid. All of them express a degree of maturity that you have reached as a human beings that is not like, bad or inferior. You actually start to appreciate that each one of these levels have a meaning. They have evolved throughout our history, and they created great things, and they kind of have a meaning and they belong there. But you also start seeing that all of these levels have some good things about them and some bad things. And you actually start to work to maximize the good things and to minimize the bad things. And, I could go more into that, but that's, I think, in short. So these levels actually apply to all the four quadrants. So the four quadrants we have covered before, these four levels apply to all of these different quadrants, but I won't go through this. That's maybe for another time. Here are three other authors that have a very similar notion of developmental progression between different worldviews that are not Graves and not Wilber. Robert Kegan, a Harvard psychologist, has these 5 stages here. Susan Greuter, a Swiss-based psychologist, did a lot of research around this, has tons of data. And then Bill Torbert, which is a US-based, he's actually working on action inquiry, and he has his own model that is described here. And all of them, you can see a similar kind of progression between different stages as human beings evolve and mature and as the world around them changes. So that's two of the elements that we have, and I'm just looking at time. I will be very quick to cover the remainder, as I have mentioned, and then I am recognizing that we're running a little bit late, but I will stay here if you have any questions to answer them afterwards. So states, at any stage of development, you can actually enter temporarily into a state of being. You can think of a sleeping and a waking state, for example, right? We all know what it feels like when we are sleeping and when we are awake. So that's one. Some of you might know flow states, right? When we zoom in, time disappears, the sense of self disappears, we just kind of go through that. Altered states, many people are now going into psychedelics and ayahuasca and stuff. So those are altered states of consciousness. You can also get them through, religious practices, through prayer, or like dervish swirling, for example, or through vision quest, through fasting. So those are all altered states. You have high performance states, where you are kind of at your best. You're looking about how, as a human being, you can be at your best to achieve what you want to achieve. You can actually experience any stage of experience. So you can be predominantly from the blue and orange stage, but you can actually experience turquoise, for example, or some of the higher stages temporarily. And I have already mentioned the kind of mystical practices and states that you have here. So you have the stages, which are actually expressing kind of how you develop over time, but then you also have states. And in some sense, maybe a kind of a shorthand for all of this is that when you think of Western religion and Western psychology, it's a lot about stages. And when you think of Eastern spirituality, it's a lot about states, right? That's why a lot of the Eastern mystics can actually be all in a very, very high state, but maybe if you put them in New York City, they just couldn't, they couldn't get on a train and go somewhere because they don't have like all of the stages, but they have very, very high ability to put themselves in altered states, right? So this is kind of a third element of the framework. Then we have something called lines. You might know the work of Howard Gardner, so different intelligences, like musical, visual. Some of you might know EQ, IQ, EQ, AQ, adaptability, right? We have some people in our community. You have SQ, spiritual quotient. You have MQ, moral quotient, and many others. So basically, the idea here is that on those stages, we can be developed, very developed in one line of development and maybe not so developed in another line, right? So the fact that somebody maybe is intellectually brilliant doesn't mean that it has a high emotional intelligence, right? Or the fact that somebody is very kinesthetically intelligent, like can be a very good sports person, doesn't mean that they have a very nuanced understanding of geopolitics, for example, right? Or kind of the world around them. So we all have different lines and we develop in different kind of pace around those different lines. And finally, we have something called types. And types are basically, some of you might know all of these things, right? This is actually coming from the Genius Group. So I know that Jason knows this. We have MBTI, which is 16 different types based on work Carl Jung. There's something called Enneagram, 9 different types. DISC, 4 different types. Big Five, Jordan Peterson works with this. Another kind of 5 personality traits. All of these are horizontal types. So at any stage of development, you can be any of these types, right? So they are not actually kind of connected. So, you can, any human being at any stage of development, you can take one of these personality tests and can get their reading of the different types that they are. So this is it. This is the integral theory: quadrants, stages, states, lines, and types. And just very briefly, as a final slide, so the more complex the world, the more nuanced operating system we need to succeed. So the more confusing, I was speaking at the beginning how the world is confusing. The more the confusing and complex the world gets, I think, at least my hypothesis here, or my assumption, I'll be explicit, is that the more nuanced operating system helps you to better understand and navigate the world. There are patterns in complexity that can help you to better orientate yourself in the world around you. Stages are always linked with life conditions. I have already mentioned that. You have two different ways to grow. You can grow horizontally. Within your stage of development, you can learn new skills, and that's a horizontal development. Or you can grow vertically when you actually are traversing and growing to the more complex way of seeing the world. When you do that, this is from Robert Keegan actually, things that previously you couldn't see, they were subjective to you, they become objective. Like if somebody gives you feedback about your presentation, there are some things that you don't know about yourself, they're your blind spot, they are your subject, and they make it objective. So you can look at it and say, okay, I am making too little pauses, I need to make more pauses. Now it's something objective, something you can do something about. So that's how the growth actually happens, both horizontally and vertically. And I have already mentioned the difference between the first 6 stages and the other 2 or 3 afterwards. Each stage has some healthy things and some unhealthy things. Obviously, this is a map, and map is never a territory like on the globe. It just always somehow does our best to approximate reality, but I'm sure we'll have better maps in the future. We can go both backwards and forward. And in summary, I think the answer to my original kind of question, how can we lead the world and create a better future if we don't understand it, is that I believe that we need to grow ourselves or develop ourselves into the integral way of understanding the world, and that will then help us to better orientate and have a better shot at creating a better future. So let me pause it here and just to see if there are any questions.
That is one that I'm going to have to go back and watch the replay more than once because that was a lot of information, a lot of really good information.
Was it making some sense, Jason, as I was going through it?
Yeah. I mean, it's the quadrants and stuff. But that's what I say. There's so much there. I was actually doing some screenshots and stuff, but I look forward to going back to the replay and being able to go back through and dissect each one of them. But you do like everything else you do a phenomenal job of laying things out.
Great. I was very curious how is this, for somebody that, because you haven't come across this before, right, Jason? Is your first time?
I've heard of it, but I've never
Heard
really
of it.
seen
Okay,
anything
cool.
about it. I've heard you
Super.
mention it others.
Super. That's
I,
helpful.
I I also really enjoyed your presentation, and just I think something with the term integral,
Hmm.
and understanding, like, I don't know, another book that Daniel Quinn had written,
Hmm.
was Beyond Civilization.
Hmm.
I really enjoyed that one. And it was a series of short essays. And I like the idea that the learning the lessons of the people of the past, that there's other ways of understanding reality and to really solve the problems we're facing. Like we need to be, authentic, whole humans.
Hmm.
So somehow we've sort of lost the integrity of the old, belief systems, and it formed this worldview that like we are all immersed in. And it seems that now our values and worldview is kind of fragmented. Like
Yeah.
our scientific understanding has defined everything and, you know, these clear definitions, but like our human place in that story is just it's how to say like this idea of being integral
Yeah.
of full picture
Yeah.
is
That's a
important.
yeah, it's a great observation. I think at least one of the reasons, why the world is like so fragmented is because the first six levels, when you move to the next one, you reject the previous one, right? So when we moved to science, we rejected religion. Many people rejected religion, right? So now is like, I'm actually, Czech Republic is we have like 80% of atheists, so it's kind of a interesting country in that respect. But um, originally a lot of the scientists actually were religious people, right? Like Isaac Newton was a religious person, and Charles Darwin was but as we kind of grew, the technology, the orange beam was so powerful, it kind of took over, and we have actually, I think, like throw out meaning out of our lives, right? Like Nietzsche was writing about this, like when we, remove God, there's going to be nihilism, right? Like there is nothing to live for if there is no higher purpose, then, there is nihilism, and it's not entirely like that, but I think there are different elements, and the same has happened, I think, with the explosion of orange. Like in many ways, our world today is based on blue and orange still. There is a lot of green as well, but a lot of our structures and systems are blue and orange, and that's why the human is missing, right? As you are saying, a lot of the kind of what is happening now is like trying to reawaken the human and say like there is this human being. Like it's not just about technology and science and systems, but it's about the subjective experience of a human being and what's happening, and that's also very, very important. It's just that sometimes, because again, when you look at it from this green level, you basically say it's all about the human being, and it's, and science and religion is all bad, and you kind of throw all of that out, right? And that's also not good, because what you need to integrate these things, right? As you're saying, like you need to become whole, but not in a way that you just become that, but you say like, how can we have the beauty of a human being and the power of the individual, but also the technological progress that is good for us, that is maybe life enhancing, like Buckminster Fuller wrote about this. And how can we have a sense of meaning, right, from the blue? And how can we have a sense of expression from the red? Like, how can we re-own some of these things we have, thrown out before? And that I think is possible from the integral view, just like you're saying. So for me, I think there is certain amount of hope if we are able to look at the world in that way, because if not, I mean, I don't have time for it today, but when you look at politics in the US, I mean, and you look at through these levels, it's very clear what's happening, right? You have um, conservatives that are more kind of blue and orange, and you have the Democrats who are more like orange and green. Of course, it's not always like that, but there are basically fights between these worldviews, because every one is trying to convince the other that we are right, and you are stupid, right? Basically, and there is this kind of fighting. But you can have that conversation in a constructive way, or you can have it in a destructive way. And I think it used to be in a constructive way. Now it more seems to be in a destructive way. At least looking from outside, maybe people in the US can say. Um, but I have seen somewhere like the political topics, there was overlap. There was like 30-40% overlap between Democrats and conservatives like 20 years ago. Now there is no overlap. Like they don't agree on anything. So, I think that drives us also in a kind of a bad flow. So anyway, that's some reflections, Daniel, on what you said. Very, very acute observation. Do you want to add something?
Um, yeah, just what you're saying is making me think a lot of like the development from like Nietzsche's view, I would say, was that there was something, but that we lost it. That what the
Yeah.
meaning used to be was, inspired by like the dream of our myths and legends. in a sense, this projection of human psychology, and that then somehow it's lost its substance. It was used as a political tool. And then I'm really interested in Hegel and this idea of the Hegelian dialectic, that I think just kind of the way that they discuss that, like, every viewpoint kind of contains like an implicit opposing viewpoint, and that there's this development, like you can kind of just assume that reality is somewhere in between. There's
Hmm.
some lesson in the opposing viewpoint that
Yeah.
just it's almost inevitable that there'll be the synthesis. And
Yeah.
so I
Yeah,
think there's a lot of lessons.
one thing that that at least for me with the integral view is one thing that you get better at is handling paradoxes, and I think that's what you're describing, right? Like a paradox is you almost have two things that can't coexist together, but there is actually it's almost like from one level they cannot coexist; they are one or the other. But if you move to a broader level, like if you zoom out, then suddenly you can see that they both hold a piece of truth that is important, right? Like, for example, traditionally the conservatives were always kind of the brakes on progress, so it just doesn't go crazy and we preserve some kind of continuity. And progressives would always like push boundaries farther. So they both have a point, right? But when you go only progressive and only conservative, it becomes a problem. So, even in this paradox, I think you can, from, when you zoom out, you can actually find what is good on it. But when you're at the same level, it just feels like you have to choose between one and the other. And I think sometimes we get stuck in that level. Yeah. You're spot on. That's very great. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah. First of all, thank you, Yaroslav, for sharing that. That was a very good job and a very important framework. And I really not only sense the power of it, but I realize and have been using the power of it for many years now. I actually had an opportunity to work with Don Beck many
Great.
years ago, and I've been incorporating this into my classes and my work
Super.
in organizations as well. And it's an incredibly powerful framework that's very, very useful.
Hmm.
So I really appreciate you
That's awesome.
bringing it out. I was wondering, where did you first get exposed to this? And,
Yeah, I got exposed to there's a gentleman called Christopher Cook, and he's somebody who worked with Don Beck.
Yeah,
Because that there was kind of a schism at some point. So there was like Don and he had the spiral dynamics integral, and then
right.
there was Chris and Natasha who had like the more spiral dynamics, and so Christopher was trained by Don, and I was like on that side of the
Oh,
spectrum.
okay.
And I met Don several times. Unfortunately he's no longer with us, but he was quite a remarkable person. I always very much enjoyed meeting him and learning
Yeah,
from him. So
right. I actually took spiral dynamics with him uh, in
great.
the early days before it really caught on and before the Adizes Institute picked it up and started using it in corporate consulting, which was really like a very breakthrough thing. But he'd been out promoting this, uh, for years and also applying it very dramatically. I'm sure
Yeah,
you're
he
aware.
was very good in application. He was not just a theorist. That I think would
Yeah,
make it very powerful. Actually, at least supposedly the colors that I have shown, they were actually created specifically in South Africa when
yep.
they were trying to move away
Transformation.
from, race basically. And, he was actually supporting Nelson Mandela, and they were trying to choose like racially neutral descriptions of the different stages, and they chose colors for that. Because
Yeah.
actually, it is at least I mean, there definitely probably needs to be more intercultural validation of this model, but
Mhm.
the thesis is that actually this goes beyond things like gender and race, and like it's kind of universal. It's more like a human experience. It's like we have a DNA, which is a DNA for everybody, no matter how you think of yourself and what race you are. Um,
Right.
this is like a psychological DNA, and it kind of goes across. So
Yep.
actually, I think it can be very unitive in many ways, and move us away from a lot of the things that maybe divide us, right? So
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And understanding the framework is really helpful. I understand it in terms of developmental consciousness
yeah,
of phases that people evolve through and also societies and groups
yep,
evolve through. And as you were saying, once you understand the framework, everything starts to make sense. You can see how things fit in and what the conflicts are. And what they're about at a fundamental level, which is very empowering.
Yeah.
Both, you know, as a leader.
At least for me, maybe that's also hope for everybody here that's hearing it for the first time. The first thing is like when you hear it, it's kind of overwhelming.
Yep.
But actually, maybe you rewatch it a couple of times. But then, you know, like I got trained about 14 years ago.
Mhm.
And I think the understanding is still the same. But over the last 14 years, like every article that you read, every movie that you watch, every conversation that you have, it's almost like you're plugging it in somewhere in that framework, and it's
Yeah.
becoming more and more robust and more applied. So, you know, I think I still understand pretty much the same of the framework, but actually it's now much more real for me over the years, and it only comes, you know, with certain experience, I think. I don't know if you would have a similar experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And again, I've been, you know, teaching and working with this for a long time, and have come to appreciate it more and more.
Awesome. Well, we should chat
yeah.
more.
Yeah, we definitely should. And the other thing I just want to throw in here, recommend is there's an excellent article on this that you showed the slides, the images from it, that I use in my classes. Offhand, I can't remember, but it was a really excellent overview piece presenting the framework.
Great. Maybe if you can, I can kind of be a point of contact. If you can share with me, maybe I have it, but maybe you can share, and if people are interested, I can actually share that. Great. Well, thank you everybody for coming. Sorry for keeping you 15 minutes longer, but great to have all of you here. And I'll see you around. And Dale, I'm happy to connect and discuss our experiences a bit farther. So do reach out to me.
Yes, I look forward to that too, Yaroslav.
We can
Good.
connect as well. All right, everybody. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you, Yaroslav.
Make
Very
sure
interesting.
you
Thanks,
save
everyone.
your
Thanks,
chat.
everyone.